The world knew Lou Reed as rock's defiant poet, the man who sang about the streets without apology. But on a cool October evening in 2003 at a small theater in Brooklyn, the weapon he carried wasn't his guitar. It was 20 years of silence between a father and son, about to shatter in front of 800 strangers. What happened next would rewrite everything people thought they knew about the man behind the dark sunglasses. The spotlight found Lou Reed exactly where it always did, center stage, his fingers moving across the guitar strings with the precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. He was 61 years old now, his face weathered by decades of living the lyrics he wrote, his voice still carrying that distinctive New York rasp that had defined a generation's understanding of what rock music could say. The venue was intimate by his standards, the St. Anne's Warehouse in Brooklyn, a converted tobacco warehouse that smelled of old wood and new possibilities. This wasn't Madison Square Garden. This wasn't the stadium tours of the 70s. This was something different, something closer to the bone. He had just finished the opening verse of Sweet Jane when his eyes swept across the fourth row, a habit born from years of reading audiences, measuring their energy, feeling whether they were with him or merely watching. And that's when everything stopped. Not the music, not yet, but something inside Lou Reed's chest seized up in a way that hadn't happened since 1959, when electrodes had been placed on his temples in a Brooklyn psychiatric ward. Because there, sitting between two strangers who had no idea they were witnessing history, was Sidney Joseph Reed, his father, the man who had signed the papers 44 years earlier. Before we continue this journey into one of rock's most private moments, please subscribe to this channel. What you're about to hear has never been told this way before, and there's so much more to Lou Reed's hidden story. The thing about fathers and sons is that silence has its own language. Sidney Reed had been a tax accountant, a practical man who believed in numbers and certainty, who had raised his children in Freeport, Long Island, in a house where normalcy was the highest virtue. When his teenage son had started wearing makeup, writing strange poetry, and showing what Sidney's generation called unhealthy interests, he had done what many fathers in 1959 believed was right. He had sought help, professional help. The kind that came with leather restraints and voltage coursing through brain tissue. Lou had never written a song specifically about that betrayal. He had written around it, through it, buried it in metaphors about street life and drug addiction and broken relationships. But the core wound, the thing that made him the artist who could write about pain with such unflinching clarity, had its roots in that hospital room, in the smell of antiseptic, in his mother's tears as she looked away, in his father's signature on a consent form. They hadn't spoken in any meaningful way since the mid-'80s. There had been stilted phone calls on holidays, messages passed through Lou's sister, but the kind of conversation that heals, that rebuilds, that acknowledges wounds. That had never happened. Sidney Reed had grown old, believing he had done his best. Lou Reed had grown famous, believing he had survived despite it. Until this October night, when somehow, through mechanisms that would remain forever unclear, Sidney had gotten a ticket and shown up. Lou's fingers kept moving on the guitar, muscle memory carrying him through Sweet Jane, even as his mind raced through 40 years in 3 seconds. The band behind him, veterans who had played with him long enough to read his moods, sensed something shift. His longtime bassist later said it was like watching a man recognize a ghost, not with fear, but with something more complicated. Recognition, old anger, unexpected hope. All of it crossing Lou's face in the space between one chord and the next. He could have kept going, could have finished the set as planned, walked off stage, avoided the moment entirely. That would have been the Lou Reed that people expected. The one who had built armor out of leather jackets and dark glasses, who had once released an album of pure noise rather than give record executives what they wanted. The man who didn't bend. But something was different tonight. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was the years with Laurie Anderson, who had softened some of his sharpest edges without dulling his blade. Maybe it was simply that after 6 decades of living, he was tired of carrying certain weights. Whatever the reason, Lou Reed made a decision that would become the most discussed moment of his late career. He stopped playing mid-song. The band fell away note by note like dominoes toppling in reverse, until there was only silence in the warehouse. 800 people who had come to hear the Velvet Underground catalog, who had paid to experience Walk on the Wild Side and Heroin and all the rest, suddenly found themselves in a moment so intimate it felt like trespassing. Lou stood there, guitar hanging from his shoulder, and removed his sunglasses. Those who were there said it was the first time many of them had ever seen his eyes. He looked directly at the 4th row. At Sidney, who had frozen in his seat like a photograph, one hand gripping the armrest, his face a map of every complicated emotion a father can feel when confronted by the adult child he damaged decades before. What must have been going through Sidney's mind in that moment? He was 84 years old now, a widower, his wife Toby having passed 3 years earlier. He had lived long enough to see his son become famous, then infamous, then respected, then legendary. He had read the interviews where Lou talked about his traumatic youth, though never by name, never with specifics that would point back to Freeport. He had watched from a distance as Lou found love with Rachel, then lost it, then found it again with Laurie. He had existed in that strange purgatory of estranged parents, both proud and ashamed, both defensive and regretful, and now his son was staring at him from a stage, in front of hundreds of witnesses, with an expression that Sidney couldn't read. Not anger exactly, not forgiveness either. Something else, something that hadn't been named yet. Lou spoke into the microphone, his voice quiet, forcing the audience to lean in. He said, "I need to change something in the set list. There's someone here tonight who I haven't played for in a long time." The words were simple, almost mundane, but the delivery carried weight that made strangers hold their breath. He wasn't looking at the audience anymore. His gaze was locked on Sidney, who had started to shake his head slightly, whether in denial or disbelief, no one could tell. Years later, people who were there would describe this moment in almost religious terms. The air felt heavy. Time seemed to stretch. There was a quality of witness to it, as if they understood they were present for something that transcended entertainment, that had crossed into the territory of life itself, messy and unscripted and real. Lou's guitar tech brought out a different instrument, an acoustic, worn and familiar. Lou took it without breaking eye contact with his father. He settled onto a stool that appeared from the wings, and for the first time in anyone's memory at a Lou Reed concert, he looked vulnerable. Not in the calculated way of a performer manufacturing emotion, but genuinely exposed. His hands, which had been steady through decades of performances, trembled slightly as he adjusted the tuning. The song he was about to play existed in a vault of material he had written over the years, but never released. Not everything Lou Reed created made it onto albums. Some things were too personal, too raw, too close to the truth he spent his career approaching through metaphor. This song had been written in 1988, during a period when he was supposedly clean, supposedly healthy, supposedly past his demons. But the demons that interested Lou Reed weren't just about drugs. They were about memory, about damage, about the ways we survived the people who were supposed to protect us. He called it Freeport, though that title would never appear on any official recording. It was 3 minutes and 40 seconds of melody and confession, stripped of the rock production that usually armored his work. Just voice and guitar and truth. The opening lines cut straight to the wound. He sang about a boy in a hospital room, about wanting to be good enough, about trying to understand why the people who were supposed to love you could hurt you so deeply. But this wasn't an accusation set to music. It was something more complicated. It was an attempt to understand. To see his father not as a villain, but as a man trapped in his own time, his own fears, his own limitations. Lou's voice, never technically beautiful, carried something more valuable than beauty. It carried authenticity. Every word felt lived in, paid for, earned through suffering and survival. He sang about growing up haunted, about learning to turn pain into poetry, about the strange gift of being broken early because it taught you how sharp the world really was. He sang about forgiving the unforgivable, not because it was deserved, but because carrying hate was heavier than the betrayal itself. In the fourth row, Sidney Reed's face crumpled. Not slowly, not with dignity, but all at once. The way a man breaks when armor he's worn for decades suddenly becomes too heavy to hold up. His shoulders shook. His hands covered his face. The strangers sitting next to him, who had come for a rock concert and found themselves in the middle of a family reconciliation, didn't know where to look. Some stared at the stage. Some studied their hands. A few wiped their own eyes, infected by the emotion of something they didn't fully understand, but recognized as real. Witnesses later recalled that Lou's voice never wavered during the performance, but his eyes stayed fixed on his father throughout. It was as if the entire venue, all 800 people, had disappeared, and there were only 2 men left in the universe, connected by blood and damage and the strange alchemy of music that could say what words couldn't. The song built to a bridge that addressed Sidney directly, abandoning metaphor entirely. Lou sang about watching his father grow old from a distance, about wondering if love could survive what they had been through, about the strange mathematics of forgiveness, where nothing balanced but you tried anyway. He sang about the boy he had been and the man he had become, and the fact that neither existed without the other, for better and worse. By the final verse, the song had transformed from confession to something like grace. Not the religious kind, but the human kind, messy and imperfect and hard-won. Lou sang about choosing connection over correctness, about the possibility that 2 people could be both wrong and forgivable at the same time. His voice dropped to almost a whisper on the last line, something about fathers and sons and the wounds that never quite heal, but maybe, with enough time and effort, stop bleeding. When the song ended, Lou didn't move. He sat on the stool, guitar across his lap, looking at Sidney, waiting. The audience seemed to understand that applause would be an intrusion. Silence held the room like water, everyone suspended in it, breathing shallowly, afraid to break whatever spell had been cast. Sidney stood up. The movement was slow, effortful, an old man's body protesting gravity. He stepped into the aisle, steadying himself with one hand on the seat back. No one stopped him as he walked toward the stage, though security shifted nervously in the wings. Lou watched him come, his face unreadable, behind the exhaustion of someone who had just performed emotional surgery on himself in public. When Sidney reached the stage edge, Lou set down his guitar and moved to the lip of the platform. They were separated by 4 feet of distance and 40 years of history. Sidney spoke first, his voice too quiet for anyone beyond the first few rows to hear. But those who caught the words said he offered something simple and insufficient and necessary all at once. He said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I thought I was helping." Lou's response wasn't recorded, wasn't documented, wasn't passed down except through the hazy memories of witnesses who admit they might have gotten the details wrong. But the consensus was that he said something like, "I know, Dad. I know." And then, in a gesture that felt both monumental and ordinary, he extended his hand. Sidney took it. They held on longer than a handshake required, 2 men clinging to connection like it was the only solid thing in a universe that had proven unreliable. The audience, released from the tension, erupted. Not in applause exactly, but in the kind of emotional release that sounds like relief, like joy, like the collective exhalation of people who have witnessed something transformative. Some people were crying openly, others sat stunned. The band remained frozen on stage, instruments silent, as if moving would break the moment. Lou helped his father up onto the stage, an awkward scramble that stripped away any remaining dignity in favor of something more important: presence. They stood together at center stage, and for 30 seconds, Lou Reed put his arm around his father's shoulders. The gesture was protective, possessive, claiming something that had been lost. Sidney leaned into his son, smaller now, diminished by age but held up by reconciliation. The concert continued, eventually. Lou played a shortened set, his voice hoarse with emotion, his energy focused on getting through the performance without falling apart entirely. Sidney watched from side stage, given a chair by the crew, his face wet and stunned and lit with something that might have been happiness, or might have been grief, or might have been both. After the show, they went to a diner. This detail emerged later through interviews Laurie Anderson gave after Lou's death. Just the 2 of them, father and son, in a Brooklyn diner at midnight, eating eggs and toast while the staff ignored them. Granting them the privacy that New Yorkers understand is sometimes the greatest gift you can give. They talked for 3 hours, about everything and nothing, about Toby, Lou's mother, whose death had perhaps opened the door for this reconciliation by removing the person most damaged by the family's fracture. About Lou's career, which Sidney admitted he had followed from a distance with more pride than he knew how to express. About the hospital, though this conversation was brief, painful, necessary. Sidney said again that he had thought he was helping, that the doctors had assured him it was the right thing, that he had acted out of fear for his son's future in a world that didn't tolerate difference. Lou said he believed him, said he had spent decades trying to hate him and found that hate was boring, exhausting, not worth the energy it required. They didn't become best friends. That would be dishonest to claim. But they became something. People who called each other, who had lunch once a month when Lou was in New York, who existed in each other's lives in small, careful ways. Sidney came to 3 more concerts before his death in 2005. Lou dedicated performances to him, though never again with the same raw emotion as that first night in Brooklyn. Their relationship existed in the category of healed but scarred, functional but fragile, better than nothing and less than perfect. Laurie Anderson said that Lou seemed lighter after the reconciliation. Not happy exactly, because Lou Reed's relationship with happiness was always complicated, but unburdened. He had carried his father with him for 6 decades, the weight of electroshock and betrayal and abandonment mixing with the weight of unanswered questions. Now, some of those questions had answers, insufficient but real. The young man who had been strapped to a table and shocked into submission had survived, had created art from his damage, and had lived long enough to hear his father say the words, "I'm sorry." The song from that night, Freeport, was never officially released. It exists in bootleg recordings of varying quality, passed between collectors who understand its significance. Lou never performed it again publicly. When asked about it in interviews, he deflected, changed the subject, made jokes about getting old and sentimental. But privately, friends said he considered it one of the most important things he had ever created. Not because it was his best work technically, but because it had done something music rarely accomplishes. It had changed reality. It had opened a door that both men thought had been sealed permanently. This moment between Lou Reed and his father exists in a larger story about trauma, survival, and the possibility of healing. In 1959, electroshock therapy was a common treatment for what psychiatrists called sexual deviance. Thousands of young people, primarily those who showed signs of homosexuality or gender nonconformity, were subjected to treatments designed to correct them. The practice destroyed lives, reinforced stigma, and created generations of damaged relationships between parents and children. Lou Reed never publicly identified the specifics of his electroshock experience until late in his life. He hinted at it in songs like "Kill Your Sons," in interviews where he spoke vaguely about traumatic medical interventions, in the general darkness that suffused his work. But he protected his family's privacy even as he processed his pain publicly. The decision to confront it directly, to invite his father into that confrontation through music, was radical for a man who had built his career on cool detachment and artistic distance. The people who were at St. Anne's Warehouse that October night in 2003 became custodians of a story. They spread it through the Lou Reed fan community, in music forums, in conversations with friends who hadn't been there. The story took on legendary qualities, details shifting and morphing the way all oral histories do. But the core remained consistent. They had witnessed something rare and precious. A moment when art and life collapsed into each other and produced healing instead of destruction. Music critics who later learned about the performance wrote about it in the context of Lou Reed's career-long exploration of pain and redemption. This was the artist who had written Perfect Day about heroin addiction, who had created Berlin as a concept album about abusive relationships, who had never shied away from the darkest corners of human experience. But those explorations had always maintained artistic distance, the safety of metaphor. The performance for his father stripped away that distance. It was naked in a way that made his other work seem almost cautious by comparison. The incident also illuminated something about the nature of forgiveness that Lou Reed had been circling his entire career. His songs were full of damaged people trying to connect, failing, trying again. Street Hassle, Coney Island Baby, Magic and Loss. His entire discography was a meditation on how people hurt each other and what comes after. The reconciliation with Sydney wasn't a contradiction of that work, but its fulfillment. It was Lou Reed practicing what his art had always preached, that damage is real, that forgiveness is complicated, and that connection is worth pursuing even when it's imperfect. Sydney Reed died in March 2005, 2 years after the concert. Lou was with him at the end, along with his sister. They sat in the hospital room, a space that must have carried echoes of 1959, but this time Lou was there by choice, holding his father's hand as he slipped away. At the funeral, Lou didn't perform. He spoke instead, briefly, about a man who had been flawed and human, and who had tried, in the end, to make amends. It wasn't a eulogy that absolved everything, but it acknowledged the complexity of their relationship without reducing it to villain and victim. Lou Reed himself would die 8 years later, in 2013, from liver disease. In the outpouring of tributes and retrospectives, the story of the Brooklyn concert resurfaced. Musicians spoke about it as evidence of Lou's hidden tenderness. Critics analyzed it as the culmination of his life's work. Fans who had been there recounted their versions, each slightly different, but all agreeing on the essential truth. They had seen Lou Reed do the bravest thing he had ever done, which wasn't writing controversial lyrics or defying record labels or surviving decades of drug abuse. It was choosing vulnerability, choosing to believe that reconciliation was possible, choosing his father. The song Freeport, never released, never properly recorded, never commodified into streaming revenue or radio play, might be Lou Reed's most important work. Not because it was his best songwriting, though it was powerful. Not because it showcased his guitar skills, though the performance was technically solid, but because it demonstrated the fundamental purpose of art: to transform pain into something that can be shared, understood, and potentially healed. Lou Reed spent his career writing about people society rejected: drug addicts, sex workers, trans women, the lonely and lost and broken. He gave them dignity through his attention, made them protagonists of their own stories instead of cautionary tales. In writing a song for his father, he extended that same generosity to the man who had hurt him most. He made Sidney Reed not a monster, but a person, trapped in his time, making terrible decisions out of fear and ignorance and misguided love. The audience at St. Anne's Warehouse that night witnessed something that transcended entertainment. They saw a man use the skills he had developed over a lifetime, the ability to express through music what language couldn't capture, to build a bridge across an uncrossable distance. They saw proof that art matters not because it's beautiful or clever or commercially successful, but because it can change reality. A song can't undo electroshock therapy. It can't give back the decades of silence. But it can create a space where two people can stand together, however briefly, and acknowledge each other fully. That's what Lou Reed's music had always been about, really. Not the drugs or the sex or the rock and roll mythology, though all that was there. At its core, his work was about the possibility of connection in a world designed to keep people apart. About seeing others clearly, including their damage, and choosing relationship anyway. About survival not as victory, but as ongoing process, difficult and necessary, and worth the effort. When Lou Reed saw his father in the audience that October night, he could have kept playing Sweet Jane, could have finished the set, collected his check, gone home without addressing the man in the fourth row. That would have been easier, safer, more consistent with his public persona. Instead, he stopped mid-song and did something terrifying. He told the truth, and in doing so, he gave everyone watching permission to believe that their own impossible reconciliations might also be possible. That wounds, even old ones, even deep ones, even ones inflicted by the people who were supposed to protect you, could be addressed. Not healed entirely, but acknowledged, understood, integrated into a life that continued despite them. That's the real legacy of the Brooklyn concert. Not the specific details of what Lou Reed sang or what Sidney said, but the demonstration that it's never too late. Never too late to stop running from pain. Never too late to extend a hand. Never too late to say, in whatever language you have available, even if it's just 3 chords and some honest words. I see you. I forgive you. Let's try this again. The world lost Lou Reed in 2013, but the people in that warehouse in 2003 carry something with them still. They were present for a moment that proved art's fundamental power to transform, to heal, to connect. They saw a rock legend become fully human. They witnessed a son and father find each other again. And they learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop mid-song, remove your armor, and play the truth.